Title: Why are some kids so disruptive? Have you ever been in a classroom or a public space where one child seems to have the power to disrupt everything? Maybe it was a kid shouting over the teacher, throwing a tantrum in the grocery store, or poking their classmates just to see what happens. At some point, we've all encountered these kids, the ones who refuse to follow the rules, who seem intent on creating chaos wherever they go. But here's a question that's been debated by psychologists, educators, and even exhausted parents for decades. Why are some kids so disruptive? To understand this, let's rewind to a story that might sound familiar. Picture this: an elementary school in the middle of a quiet suburban neighborhood. Mrs. Carter, a well-loved teacher with years of experience, begins her lesson on fractions. The class is calm, pencils scratching away, until he walks in. Damien, late, as usual, dragging his chair noisily across the floor, muttering something under his breath. Within 5 minutes, the classroom is no longer about fractions. Damien is making animal noises, flicking erasers at the back of heads, and rolling his eyes at every attempt to reel him back in. By lunchtime, the class feels like a battlefield, and Mrs. Carter is left questioning everything she thought she knew about teaching. Now, before we label Damien as a bad kid, let's dig deeper. What if I told you that disruptive behavior often has a root cause, a trigger that's invisible to the untrained eye? You see, most kids don't act out just for the fun of it. Let's start with one of the biggest reasons: unmet emotional needs. Think about it: kids are like little emotional sponges. When their home life is filled with chaos, neglect, or inconsistency, they absorb it. Damien's parents, for example, might be going through a messy divorce. He's angry, confused, and unsure how to process these emotions, so he expresses them the only way he knows how: by seeking attention. And in a classroom, even negative attention can feel better than being ignored. But it's not just emotional turmoil. Sometimes, disruptive kids are actually battling internal challenges that most adults can't see. Take ADHD, for instance. Did you know that children with ADHD are twice as likely to be labeled as troublemakers in school? Their brains are wired differently. Imagine being unable to sit still, no matter how hard you try. The chair feels like it's on fire, the clock ticks louder than the teacher's voice, and your hands just need to move. It's not defiance, it's biology. And yet, these kids are often met with frustration instead of understanding. Here's where it gets even more fascinating. Neuroscience reveals that the part of the brain responsible for impulse control and decision-making, the prefrontal cortex, doesn't fully develop until around age 25. So, when you're looking at a disruptive 10-year-old, you're literally seeing an incomplete operating system. Now imagine adding trauma into the mix. Research shows that children who experience adverse childhood experiences, things like abuse, neglect, or witnessing violence, have a harder time regulating their emotions and behavior. For them, the world feels like a constant threat, and acting out is their way of saying, "I don't feel safe." But let's pivot for a moment, because not all disruptive kids are struggling with trauma or a diagnosis. Some are just incredibly bored. Yes, boredom. Imagine being a kid who finishes their assignments twice as fast as everyone else. While the rest of the class is still learning to multiply, you're already solving equations in your head. For these kids, disruption becomes a form of entertainment, a way to inject excitement into an otherwise monotonous day. This is often seen in gifted children, whose intellectual curiosity doesn't always align with traditional classroom structures. And then, there are the social factors. Peer pressure can turn even the most well-behaved child into a mischief maker. Picture this: a quiet, shy kid joins a new school. To fit in, they start cracking jokes during lessons or pulling pranks to impress their classmates. Over time, this behavior sticks, not because it's who they are, but because it's who they feel they need to be to belong. Now, here's where the plot thickens. Disruptive behavior doesn't just affect the kid causing it, it ripples outward. Teachers feel the strain, other students lose valuable learning time, and parents often feel embarrassed or powerless. It's a vicious cycle. The more a child is punished or excluded, the more their behavior worsens. They become the disruptive kid, a label that follows them for years and chips away at their self-esteem. But here's the twist: disruption can also be a sign of potential. Many disruptive kids are natural leaders. They're the ones who question authority, challenge norms, and refuse to settle for the status quo. Sure, it might drive teachers and parents up the wall, but think about the innovators and change makers in history. How many of them do you think were easy kids? Steve Jobs was famously rebellious in school. Albert Einstein was considered a problem child by his teachers. Disruption, when channeled correctly, can become creativity, resilience, and leadership. So, what's the solution? How do we help these kids and everyone around them? The answer isn't one size fits all, but it starts with understanding. When a child acts out, ask why. What are they trying to communicate? Is it frustration, fear, curiosity? Next, provide structure without rigidity. Kids thrive when they know what's expected of them, but they also need room to make mistakes and grow. And perhaps most importantly, offer empathy. A simple, "I see you" can go a long way in making a child feel valued. Let's not forget the bigger picture. Every disruptive kid is a reminder that behavior is a form of communication. Instead of seeing these children as problems to fix, what if we saw them as puzzles to solve? What if, instead of punishing their behavior, we nurtured their potential? Because underneath the noise, the tantrums, and the defiance, there's always a story, one that's waiting for someone to listen. So the next time you encounter a Damien, pause. Ask yourself, what's really going on here? And remember, every child, no matter how disruptive, deserves a chance to be understood. Because sometimes, the kids who seem the hardest to love are the ones who need it the most.